Lysander Santoro stood motionless before the crystal-clear window of Winterbell's most exclusive Christmas decoration boutique, his reflection ghosting over a 12-foot noble fir adorned with hand-blown Venetian glass ornaments. The store had closed 3 hours earlier, yet he remained planted on the snow-dusted sidewalk, expensive Italian leather shoes collecting powder he didn't bother to shake off. His wool coat hung open, despite temperatures hovering near freezing, as if cold were something that happened to other people. The window display represented perfection money could buy: cascading silver ribbons, porcelain angels with actual gold leaf wings, velvet stockings embroidered with crystals that caught streetlight and fractured it into rainbow shards. He studied this manufactured magic with the detachment of someone cataloging inventory rather than experiencing wonder. Behind him, the commercial district stretched empty and silent, storefronts dark except for security lights. Christmas Eve had driven everyone home hours ago, leaving the streets to him and the falling snow that muffled sound until the world felt wrapped in cotton. Lysander had dismissed his driver at 7, sent his security detail away at 8, choosing solitude over protection. The imported timepiece on his wrist read 11:47, which meant he'd been standing here for nearly 4 hours. Mom said it didn't come again this year. The voice arrived without warning, small and matter-of-fact, cutting through his isolation like scissors through silk. Lysander turned with the controlled precision of someone whose reflexes had been honed by necessity, finding a child approximately 6 years old standing 3 feet away. She wore a baby pink sweater that had seen better seasons, jeans that fit well enough to suggest careful shopping on limited budget, and sneakers with characters he didn't recognize. Her nose glowed pink from cold, huge eyes reflecting the window display with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing details rather than simply looking. Lysander's first instinct was to leave immediately because children represented complications his life couldn't accommodate. Yet something about her complete lack of fear kept him rooted. She wasn't looking at him with the wariness adults showed when they recognized predatory competence in another human. Instead, she studied him with focused curiosity. "Santa Claus," she clarified, apparently interpreting his silence as confusion rather than the paralysis it actually was. "Mom said he probably wouldn't come again because he's very busy and sometimes he forgets the apartments on Sterling Street." Her tone carried no bitterness, just practical acceptance of someone explaining obvious facts. The matter-of-fact delivery created cognitive dissonance in Lysander's carefully ordered mind because children weren't supposed to accept disappointment with such philosophical calm. He opened his mouth to ask where her mother was, then closed it because the question felt like accepting responsibility for a situation he'd never agreed to enter. "The tree in the window is my favorite," she continued, apparently unbothered by his lack of response. "I like how the ornaments aren't all the same color, how they put the gold ones next to the silver ones." She stepped closer to the glass, pressing small hands against the window. "At school, Miss Patterson said that's called composition." Lysander found himself looking at the display through her eyes, seeing intentional artistry where he'd only cataloged expensive components moments before. The arrangement did follow sophisticated design principles, each ornament placed to create visual flow that drew the eye in a specific pattern. He'd spent years learning to read patterns in business deals, yet somehow missed the deliberate beauty being sold. "I'm Bertie," she announced, turning back to face him with the kind of direct introduction adults had forgotten how to give. "My real name is Bridget Eleanor Rose, but that's too many names for one person, so everyone just calls me Bertie." She waited expectantly, clearly anticipating reciprocal introduction. "Lysander," he heard himself say, then immediately regretted the automatic response because names created connection, and connection created vulnerability. He should have lied, given her some generic alias that would evaporate from memory the moment this strange encounter ended. Instead, he'd handed over his actual identity to a 6-year-old with no concept of power structures. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he added, trying to reassert some form of adult authority over a situation that felt increasingly beyond his control. The words came out less commanding than he'd intended, more concerned than someone of his position should sound. Bertie smiled at him like he'd said something amusing rather than sensible. "I'm not alone. I'm with you," Bertie replied with the flawless logic of childhood, gesturing between them as if his presence constituted adequate supervision. "And besides, Mom's building is right there." She pointed across the street to a converted warehouse divided into apartments. Warm light glowed from several windows, including one on the 3rd floor, where a small decorated tree was visible. The explanation reconfigured the entire situation from child in danger to child being monitored, which should have relieved Lysander, but instead created new discomfort because it meant someone was watching this interaction. He glanced up at the lit window, imagining a mother tracking her daughter's movements while simultaneously preparing for night shift work that required leaving a 6-year-old alone on Christmas Eve. The angel on top is real porcelain, Bertie continued her narration, apparently content to have a silent audience for her observations. I looked it up on the library computer because I wanted to know what makes some decorations cost so much. She traced the angel's outline on the glass with one finger. Porcelain is special clay that gets fired in really hot ovens. Her casual mention of library research to understand luxury goods created a portrait of intelligence applied to circumstances that couldn't provide what that mind deserved. Lysander recognized the hunger for knowledge, remembered his own childhood questions about how things worked and why. The difference was that his questions had been answered by private tutors and temperature-controlled libraries, not public computers. "Do you have a tree?" Bertie asked, pivoting from her lecture on porcelain production to direct inquiry with the seamless transition children managed naturally. The question landed with unexpected weight, because the honest answer was no. His penthouse contained no seasonal decorations whatsoever. Christmas was something other people celebrated, families engaged with, not solitary men who deliberately excised sentiment from their existence. "I have a tree," Lysander found himself saying, the lie emerging before conscious decision could prevent it. "But it's not decorated yet." The fabrication continued building momentum, creating fictional scenarios his actual life had never contained. "I haven't decided on a color scheme." Bertie's eyes widened with an expression that suggested he'd just admitted to criminal negligence rather than simple procrastination. "You have to decorate before Christmas," she informed him with the absolute certainty of someone explaining universal laws to the uninformed. "Otherwise, it's just a tree inside a house," which doesn't make any sense. Her logic was unassailable, her tone patient despite dealing with someone clearly lacking basic knowledge. "Miss Patterson says the decorating is the important part, because that's when you put your personality on the tree." Lysander had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals with men who'd killed for less than what was at stake, yet found himself unable to counter a 6-year-old's reasoning about Christmas tree decoration protocols. The absurdity of the situation should have prompted him to end this interaction, walk away, return to his carefully controlled isolation. Instead, he heard himself asking what colors she would recommend, as if her opinion carried weight in decisions he'd never actually make. "Not all one color," Bertie said immediately, her response carrying the confidence of someone who'd given this considerable thought. "That's boring, and it makes the tree look like it's wearing a uniform instead of celebrating." She gestured toward the boutique window where the display tree showcased exactly the kind of mixed palette she was advocating. "You want it to look happy, not matchy." The distinction between happy and matchy represented a design philosophy Lysander had never encountered in his world of coordinated aesthetics and professional decorators who build by the hour. Everything in his life matched, from his custom suits to his penthouse furnishings, creating environments that projected power through careful curation. The idea that happiness might require intentional discord challenged assumptions he hadn't known he was making. "I could help you," Bertie offered, the suggestion emerging with the casualness of someone proposing they share an umbrella, rather than volunteering to enter a stranger's home. "I'm really good at decorating because I pay attention to composition and color theory." She said this without arrogance, simply stating facts about her capabilities. "Mom says I have an eye for making things beautiful, even when we don't have money for the fancy stuff." The offer created immediate complications, because accepting meant allowing this child, and presumably her mother, into his private space, crossing boundaries he'd maintained for 15 years. Lysander's penthouse was a fortress against connection, designed specifically to prevent the kind of intimacy that led to vulnerability, yet something about her earnest offer, her genuine desire to help someone who clearly needed assistance with basic life skills like tree decoration, made refusal feel cruel rather than sensible. "Your mother would have to agree," he said, recognizing even as he spoke that he was negotiating terms rather than declining outright, "and it would need to be at a time that works with her schedule." The practicalities created distance from the emotional implications of what he was actually proposing, which was allowing strangers access to the carefully constructed emptiness he called home. "Mom works nights at Giovanni's," Bertie supplied, naming a restaurant Lysander knew by reputation as a place where service staff worked double shifts for tips that barely covered rent. "She does Tuesday through Saturday, 6 to 2 in the morning." The casual delivery of this information, revealed a child who understood her mother's schedule with precision born of necessity. So we could do it Sunday or Monday if you want. Lysander calculated the implications of this timeline, realized that Christmas would be over by Sunday, rendering the entire exercise pointless, except as an excuse to maintain contact with people he had no logical reason to see again. The rational part of his mind that had kept him alive in dangerous circumstances screamed warnings about emotional entanglement. The other part, the one he'd successfully suppressed for over a decade, whispered that maybe purposeless connection was exactly what his life lacked. Monday, he heard himself say, committing to a future interaction before he could reconsider. If your mother approves. He reached into his coat pocket, extracted one of the business cards he normally reserved for legitimate business contacts, and handed it to Bertie. The card listed his import company, a phone number that went to his personal line, nothing that revealed the full scope of his family's operations. Bertie accepted the card with both hands, studying it with the same focused attention she'd given the window display. Lysander Santoro, Import Acquisitions, she read aloud, sounding out the longer words with careful deliberation. That's a fancy title. She looked up at him with renewed interest. Do you import Christmas decorations? Is that why you know about the porcelain angels? The question demonstrated reasoning skills that would serve her well if life gave her opportunities to develop them, which seemed unlikely given her current circumstances. Lysander found himself wanting to answer honestly, to explain that his family's import business dealt primarily in luxury goods from Europe, including the very ornaments she'd been admiring. Instead, he simply nodded, allowing her to maintain whatever assumptions made him seem less dangerous than he actually was. I should go back now, Bertie announced, glancing toward her building where the third-floor window still glowed with warm light. Mom will be leaving for work soon, and she likes me to wave goodbye from the window. She carefully tucked his business card into her jeans pocket. I'll show her your card and tell her about helping with your tree. Before Lysander could formulate a response, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist in a brief hug that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like it rearranged something fundamental in his chest. The gesture carried no agenda, no manipulation, just pure impulse from someone who'd decided he was worth hugging. Then she released him and started across the street, turning once to wave before disappearing into the building's entrance. Lysander stood frozen in the aftermath of that unexpected embrace, his expensive coat still holding the warmth where small arms had circled his torso. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with affection rather than calculation, had initiated physical contact that sought nothing except brief connection. The sensation lingered like evidence of something he'd lost without noticing it was gone. The window on the 3rd floor drew his attention, and he watched as Bertie appeared there moments later, pressing her face against the glass and waving with both hands. Behind her, a figure moved into view, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She placed a hand on Bertie's shoulder, then looked down toward the street where Lysander still stood. Even from this distance, he could read surprise in her posture. Lysander raised one hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that felt absurdly formal given the circumstances, but was all his muscle memory knew how to produce. The woman returned the wave with visible hesitation, then gently pulled Bertie back from the window. The small tree in their apartment seemed to glow brighter for a moment, or perhaps that was simply contrast against the surrounding darkness. Lysander remained on the sidewalk after Bertie disappeared from the window, his mind processing an interaction that had violated every protocol his life normally followed. He should leave now, call his driver, return to the penthouse and forget this entire strange encounter. Instead, he found himself studying the building across the street, noting details he'd never bothered to observe despite driving past this location countless times. The structure had been converted from its industrial origins with minimal investment. Windows added where loading doors had once stood. Fire escapes bolted to brick that showed decades of weather damage. Lights glowed from perhaps half the units, suggesting occupancy rates that reflected either affordable rent or low standards. This was the kind of building his family's real estate holdings would acquire and demolish, replacing with luxury condos that generated better returns. Movement at the building's entrance pulled his attention from architectural assessment, and he watched as the woman from the window emerged, now wearing a coat thrown hastily over what appeared to be a restaurant uniform. She moved with purpose across the street toward him, her body language broadcasting both determination and apprehension. This had to be Bertie's mother, coming to confront the stranger her daughter had been talking to for the past 20 minutes. Lysander braced himself for justified anger, prepared explanations that wouldn't sound predatory. calculated what his security team would say about this monumentally stupid situation he'd allowed to develop. The woman stopped 6 feet away, maintaining careful distance that demonstrated awareness of the risk strange men represented. Up close, she looked younger than he'd expected, probably not yet 30, with features that would have been striking if exhaustion hadn't settled into every line. "I'm Everly," she said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that came from dealing with situations that required diplomacy despite triggering fear. "Birdie's mother." She didn't extend her hand, kept her arms crossed over her chest in unconscious protective posture. "She told me you were nice to her, that you talked about the window decorations." The statement hung between them, neither quite accusation nor acceptance. "She approached me," Lysander replied, recognizing that this distinction mattered even though it didn't actually absolve him of anything. "I didn't seek out interaction with your daughter." The formal phrasing made him sound like he was testifying rather than explaining. His default mode went under scrutiny. "She wanted to look at the Christmas display." Everly's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for him to categorize, finally settling on something that might have been resigned understanding rather than relief. "She does that," she said, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Talks to people like they're already friends. I've tried to teach her about stranger danger, but she thinks everyone is basically good until proven otherwise." The admission carried both pride and worry. "She gave you her business card," Everly continued, pulling the small rectangle from her pocket and studying it with an expression Lysander couldn't quite read. "Said you have a tree that needs decorating, and you might want help." She looked up at him directly for the first time. Green eyes searching his face for information his features had been trained not to reveal. Is that actually true? Or was she reading a situation wrong? The question gave him an exit, an easy way to dismiss the entire interaction as childish misunderstanding and walk away from whatever this was becoming. Lysander opened his mouth to take that exit, to politely disengage and return to his regularly scheduled isolation. Instead, he heard himself confirming the story. "I do have a tree, and she's right that it needs decorating." The lies were getting easier, building on themselves. "Mr. Santoro?" Everly began, his name sounding strange in her voice, like she was testing the weight of syllables she'd never expected to speak. "I appreciate that you were kind to Birdie, but I can't have her bothering strangers with offers to come decorate their homes." She delivered this with the gentle firmness of someone enforcing boundaries despite knowing it would disappoint her child. "Whatever she proposed, I need to decline on her behalf." "What if I was the one proposing it?" Lysander asked, surprising himself more than her with the question. He watched her eyes widen slightly, saw her recalculate what kind of situation she was actually navigating. "She clearly has talent for design," mentioned color theory and composition. "I could use that expertise." The justification sounded hollow even to him, but he continued anyway. Everly studied him with the kind of assessment people developed when they'd learned to recognize trouble before it arrived, when survival depended on reading situations accurately. Lysander stood still under that scrutiny, let her look for whatever signs would help her make this decision. He knew what she was seeing. Expensive clothes, controlled posture, the kind of polish that came from privilege. What she couldn't see was whether those markers predicted safety or threat. "I work nights," she said finally, the statement seeming to emerge from some internal calculation he couldn't follow. "Which means Birdie would be asleep during any time I could supervise a visit." And she paused, choosing next words carefully. "I can't bring my daughter to a stranger's home without me present. I'm sure you understand." The apologetic tone couldn't quite mask the absolute firmness of this boundary. "What if I hired you to bring her?" Lysander asked, the solution appearing fully formed, like his mind had been working on this problem without his conscious awareness. "As a consultant for interior design. Standard hourly rate, professional arrangement." He was making this up as he went, applying business frameworks to a situation that had nothing to do with commerce. The offer hung between them. While Everly processed implications, Lysander was only beginning to recognize himself. He was essentially proposing to pay this woman to spend time in his home with her daughter, which could be interpreted as either surprisingly ethical or deeply suspicious depending on perspective. Her face showed she was running both scenarios, weighing risk against whatever his money might provide. Why? The single word carried more weight than elaborate questions would have, demanded truth he wasn't entirely sure he could provide. Everly's eyes hadn't left his face, were reading micro-expressions his control usually prevented. "Why would you want a 6-year-old and her mother to come decorate a tree in your home? What's actually happening here?" Lysander didn't have an answer that made sense even to himself, Couldn't explain why a chance encounter outside a closed shop had penetrated defenses he'd spent 15 years reinforcing. The honest response was that Bertie's hug had reminded him he was still capable of feeling something besides the cold calculation that had become his default state. But saying that out loud would reveal vulnerability to someone who had every reason to view him as threat rather than opportunity. "I've been alone a long time," he said instead, offering partial truth because complete honesty felt too dangerous. "Sometimes that makes you forget what normal interaction looks like." He gestured toward the building she'd emerged from. "Your daughter reminded me of something I'd lost. I'd like to not lose it again quite so quickly." Everly's expression shifted through several calculations before settling on cautious consideration, her posture remaining guarded, but no longer quite as defensive. She pulled her coat tighter despite the gesture doing nothing against cold that came from uncertainty rather than temperature. "Professional arrangement," she repeated, testing the words like someone checking if ice would hold weight, "with clear boundaries and scheduled times. Monday afternoon," Lysander confirmed, recognizing negotiation when he heard it and knowing when to let the other party set terms. 2 hours, compensated at whatever rate you deem appropriate for design consultation. He kept his voice neutral, businesslike, stripping away any inflection that might suggest this was anything other than a standard transaction. "My penthouse is in the Ashford building on Merchant Street." The address landed with visible impact because everyone in the city knew the Ashford, knew that its residences started at prices most people couldn't earn in a decade. Everly's eyes widened fractionally before she controlled the reaction, but Lysander had already seen the recalibration happening behind her expression. He'd just revealed himself as someone operating in a financial stratosphere so far above hers that normal social rules might not apply. "I need to get to work," Everly said, glancing at the slim watch on her wrist that had seen better years. "Giovanni's doesn't accept lateness even on Christmas Eve." She pulled a pen from her coat pocket, wrote a phone number on the back of his business card, and handed it back to him. "Text me the address and apartment number. I'll let you know by Sunday if we're coming." The fact that she hadn't agreed outright demonstrated wisdom Lysander respected, showed she understood that sleeping on decisions prevented mistakes desperation might cause. She was protecting her daughter by building in time to research him, to verify that the Ashford address was real, to perhaps ask around about whether Lysander Santoro was someone safe to trust. He nodded acceptance of these terms without argument. "Bertie mentioned Santa Claus forgot Sterling Street again," Lysander said, the observation emerging before he'd consciously decided to speak. "Does that happen often?" The question ventured into territory their professional arrangement didn't cover, but something about the casual way Bertie had accepted disappointment bothered him more than he wanted to examine. Everly's face closed down immediately, pride replacing the cautious openness that had been developing. "We manage fine," she said, each word clipped and defensive. "Bertie understands that Christmas isn't about presents, that some years are harder than others." The statement dared him to pity them, to make this about charity rather than the business transaction she was willing to consider. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise," Lysander replied, recognizing he'd stumbled into sensitive territory that required careful navigation. "I was simply noting that she seems remarkably well-adjusted for someone dealing with disappointment." He paused, then added, "You've clearly done excellent work raising her." The compliment was genuine, which made it feel strange leaving his mouth. Something in Everly's expression softened slightly, the compliment landing in a way his money never could because it acknowledged her effort rather than her circumstances. "She's a good kid," Everly said, and for the first time, her voice carried warmth instead of just wariness. "Smart, curious, sees beauty in things most people walk past." She glanced back toward her building where the third-floor window still glowed. "I try to make sure the world doesn't damage that." The protective fierceness in that statement resonated with something Lysander recognized from his own family, though applied in completely different context. His grandfather had been similarly protective, though his methods involved eliminating threats rather than simply shielding loved ones from them. The impulse was the same even if the execution differed. "She's lucky to have you," he said, meaning it. Everly studied him for a long moment, and Lysander had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen rather than simply observed. "Monday at 2, she finally said, making the decision in real time rather than waiting until Sunday. 2 hours, $200. She named a rate that was simultaneously too low for what she was actually risking, and probably more than she made in a full shift at Giovanni's. 300, Lysander countered, watching her eyes widen. For the expertise and the inconvenience of working on your day off. He said it like the additional 100 was about fair compensation, rather than the fact that 200 felt insulting, given what he spent on dinner without thinking. Plus, I'll arrange a car service for transportation since I assume you don't own a vehicle. The assumption was confirmed by the way her cheeks flushed slightly, embarrassment at having her circumstances so accurately read, warring with relief that she wouldn't have to navigate public transportation. Fine, she agreed, the word emerging like she was accepting more than just money. But I reserve the right to leave immediately if anything feels inappropriate. The boundary was non-negotiable, her tone making that absolutely clear. Understood, Lysander said, respecting the line she was drawing even as he wondered what experiences had taught her to draw it so firmly. I'll text you the details tonight. He glanced toward Giovanni's, which was visible 3 blocks down where holiday lights still blazed despite the late hour. You should go. I've already made you later than you intended. Everly nodded, took 2 steps toward the restaurant, then turned back. Thank you, she said, and the gratitude carried layers he couldn't fully unpack. For being kind to Bertie, for not being what I was afraid you might be when I saw her talking to you. The admission cost her something to make, vulnerability she clearly didn't share easily. I have a sister, Lysander heard himself say, offering information he never shared with anyone outside his immediate circle. Had. She would have been about Bertie's age when she died. The words emerged without his permission, pulled out by something in Everly's expression. She used to talk to strangers too, saw the world the same way your daughter does. The revelation hung between them, explaining something about his reaction to Bertie that Lysander hadn't fully understood himself until speaking it aloud. Everly's face shifted through shock, sympathy, understanding, landing on a complicated expression that acknowledged shared loss without presuming to compare. I'm sorry, she said simply, the words carrying weight because she clearly meant them. Monday at 2, Lysander repeated, redirecting before emotion could complicate what needed to remain a simple transaction. I'll send the car at 1:30. He stepped back, creating physical distance that matched the emotional boundary he was reconstructing. Everly held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked toward Giovanni's without looking back. Lysander watched until she disappeared into the restaurant, then finally pulled out his phone to call his driver. The screen showed 12 messages from his head of security, increasingly concerned about his location and extended absence. He ignored them all, instead opening a new text to the number Everly had written on his card. The message took longer to compose than any business communication he'd ever crafted, each word weighed for implications and interpretations. Finally, he settled on simple facts: the Ashford's address, his apartment number, confirmation that a car would arrive at 1:30 Monday afternoon. He added one final line about looking forward to Bertie's design expertise, then deleted it as too personal, then added it back because the impersonal version felt wrong. Christmas morning arrived with silence so complete it felt unnatural, the city wrapped in collective pause that happened only once a year. Lysander stood at his penthouse window watching empty streets below, untouched coffee growing cold on the marble counter behind him. Sleep had been impossible after returning home, his mind replaying fragments of conversation with precision usually reserved for contract negotiations. The 6-year-old's hug and the mother's cautious green eyes circled endlessly through his thoughts. The business card with Everly's phone number sat on his desk, where he'd placed it immediately upon entering the penthouse, the small rectangle carrying weight disproportionate to its physical presence. He'd picked it up 19 times since last night, opened his phone to compose texts he couldn't formulate, then set everything down without sending anything. The paralysis was foreign to someone whose professional existence consisted of decisive action executed without hesitation. Yet here he stood unable to manage a simple confirmation message about Monday's arrangement. The Douglas fir dominated his living room like an accusation, 12 feet of undecorated evergreen representing commitments made to strangers, based on nothing more substantial than momentary connection. Lysander approached the tree slowly, running his palm along branches that released sharp pine scent into air, usually perfumed by expensive candles. The tree was real in a way nothing else in his curated environment was, living proof he'd allowed spontaneity to override 15 years of careful control. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, the annual Christmas greeting arriving with mechanical precision at 9 o'clock every December 25th. The message contained no warmth, just formal acknowledgement of the holiday, and reminder about family dinner scheduled for the following week. Lysander stared at the text, comparing its cold efficiency to Bertie's enthusiastic chatter about Christmas decorations and composition theory. The distance between those two worlds stretched impossibly wide. Marcus called twice before noon, ostensibly about year-end business, but actually checking on Lysander's uncharacteristic behavior the previous evening. The security chief's instincts were sharp enough to recognize when his employer's patterns shifted in ways suggesting either threat or opportunity. Lysander let both calls go to voicemail, unprepared to articulate what was happening when he barely understood it himself. Explaining that a child's innocent conversation had created fault lines in his carefully constructed isolation felt impossible. Across the city, Everly arrived home from Giovanni's at 3 a.m, her feet aching and her uniform smelling of grease and desperation that clung to late-night restaurant work. She checked on Bertie first, finding her daughter sprawled across their narrow bed with the abandoned comfort only children achieved in sleep. One arm hung off the mattress, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since age 2. The business card Lysander had given Bertie sat on their kitchen table where Everly had placed it after her daughter excitedly showed it to her. Expensive cardstock that felt wrong in their space of secondhand furniture and appliances that worked through determination rather than actual functionality. She picked it up, studying the raised lettering that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Lysander Santoro, Import Acquisitions, the card proclaimed with understated elegance. She opened her laptop, the 7-year-old machine taking its customary 2 minutes to wake from sleep mode, while she made tea in a mug with a chipped handle. The search bar felt simultaneously innocuous and dangerous, a portal to information that might confirm her worst fears about the well-dressed stranger her daughter had befriended. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating whether ignorance might be safer than knowledge. Then she typed his name with resigned determination that came from years of facing uncomfortable truths. The search results loaded with damning abundance, page after page of society photographs and business articles painting a picture of wealth operating in spheres so far above her reality they might as well exist on different planets. Lysander Santoro at charity galas wearing tuxedos that cost more than her annual rent, standing beside people whose names she recognized from news coverage of political scandals. The photographs showed a man with controlled expression and careful distance from everyone around him. Nothing like the uncertain person who'd stood in the snow talking to Bertie. Further down the search results, articles grew more concerning. Mentions of his family's import business discussed with careful language suggesting legal complications nobody wanted to answer directly. References to his grandfather's generation building an empire through connections that predated modern oversight. Allusions to power structures operating outside conventional frameworks. Everly's stomach tightened as she read between carefully worded lines, understanding crystallizing that she'd agreed to bring her daughter to the home of someone whose family history involved exactly the kind of danger she'd spent years protecting Bertie from. She should cancel, send a polite text declining his offer, and return to their safe, predictable life of financial struggle and emotional isolation. The rational part of her brain that had kept them surviving through impossible circumstances screamed this obvious conclusion, listing all the ways this situation could go catastrophically wrong. Yet something stopped her from reaching for her phone. Some instinct insisting the man in these photographs wasn't quite the same person who'd admitted to being lonely. The vulnerability in his voice when he'd mentioned his sister had felt genuine, in a way staged photographs never could. Saturday morning brought Bertie's relentless questions about Monday's planned visit, her enthusiasm immune to the fact that her mother had slept only 3 hours. She wanted to know what kind of tree Lysander had, what colors they should recommend, whether his apartment was as fancy as the buildings she'd seen in movies. Everly answered with the patience born of 6 years of constant curiosity, even as her own anxiety about the arrangement grew with each innocent inquiry. Lysander spent Saturday in his home office, attempting to focus on year-end financial reports that required attention before the new year. The numbers blurred together, his usual ability to find patterns in data completely absent, while his mind wandered to the conversation he still needed to initiate. He'd drafted 17 different text messages to Everly, each version either too formal or too casual, too presumptuous or too distant. The difficulty of finding appropriate tone for someone who existed in the uncomfortable space between stranger and something more felt insurmountable. Finally, Sunday afternoon arrived with the weight of a deadline he could no longer avoid, forcing Lysander to compose the message he'd been paralyzed about for 2 days. He settled on simple facts: the Ashford's address, his apartment number, confirmation that car service would arrive at 1:30 Monday afternoon. The message felt inadequate given the magnitude of what he was asking, but anything more elaborate risked revealing the anxiety churning beneath his controlled exterior. He hit send before he could reconsider, then immediately wondered if he should have included something warmer. Everly's phone buzzed with the incoming text while she folded laundry, the notification making her heart rate spike in a way that felt disproportionate to a simple message. She made herself finish folding 3 shirts before checking, creating artificial delay that did nothing to calm nervous anticipation building in her chest. The address confirmed everything her research had revealed about the vast gap between their circumstances, the Ashford representing luxury she'd only seen in magazine spreads about how the wealthy lived. She stared at those details, feeling the full weight of what she was agreeing to by bringing Bertie into that world. The building where doormen wore uniforms and elevators required special keys to access penthouses would make their second-hand clothes and careful budgeting painfully visible. Yet Bertie's excitement about helping someone with his Christmas tree, her genuine belief that Lysander needed their assistance, made canceling feel like crushing something innocent and good. Everly typed a simple confirmation, adding that they would be ready at the specified time. The message felt inadequate, but anything more elaborate risked revealing how thoroughly the situation had disrupted her carefully maintained equilibrium. She hit send, then immediately second-guessed whether she should have established more explicit boundaries or expectations. The uncertainty was exhausting, this constant oscillation between hope that maybe this could be something positive and fear that she was making a catastrophic mistake. Bertie appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite baby pink sweater, already planning her outfit for Monday despite it being a full day away. "Mom, do you think Lysander has ever decorated a Christmas tree before?" she asked, the question emerging from wherever her active mind had been processing the situation. "Because if he hasn't, we'll need to teach him everything. Not just about colors, but about the feeling you're supposed to get when you look at it." Sunday morning arrived with the kind of brilliant winter sunshine that made snow-covered streets look like something from a postcard rather than the logistical nightmare they actually created. Lysander stood in his penthouse living room, staring at the bare 12-foot Douglas fir his staff had delivered and installed the previous afternoon. The tree occupied the corner where a modern sculpture usually stood, looking simultaneously majestic and accusatory in its undecorated state. He'd spent Saturday morning actually purchasing a tree, an activity he'd never personally undertaken in his adult life. The lot owner had been startled when Lysander arrived without assistants or decorators, even more surprised when he'd selected the tree himself, based on criteria he'd absorbed from Bertie's window commentary. The fir had good composition, branches distributed in a way that suggested intentional artistry, rather than random growth. The tree's presence transformed his carefully curated space in ways he hadn't anticipated, introducing organic irregularity into rooms designed for geometric precision. Every other object in the penthouse had been selected by professionals who understood his aesthetic preferences, arranged to project power through minimalist sophistication. The tree refused to coordinate with this vision, demanded attention through sheer living presence. Lysander's phone buzzed with Everly's response, arriving 36 hours after his initial text like she'd spent the entire weekend deciding whether to actually come. The message was brief, professional, confirming receipt of information and noting they would be ready at 1:30. No pleasantries, no questions, just acknowledgement of the arrangement. He found himself reading it multiple times anyway, analyzing tone that probably didn't exist in such sparse communication. His head of security, Marcus, appeared in the doorway with the kind of expression that suggested an intervention was imminent. The man had been with Lysander's family for 20 years, had watched him grow from angry teenager into controlled adult, and took certain liberties that came with that history. "You're having visitors tomorrow," Marcus said, statement rather than question, because obviously he'd already been briefed by building security. "A design consultant and her daughter," Lysander replied, keeping his tone neutral, even though he knew this explanation wouldn't satisfy. "They're helping with the tree." He gestured toward the fir like its presence explained everything, though it actually explained nothing about why he was personally involving himself in decoration. Marcus studied the tree, then Lysander, then back to the tree with an expression that suggested he was solving an equation that didn't balance correctly. "You've never decorated for Christmas," he observed, carefully not making it sound like an accusation. "In 15 years, you've never acknowledged the holiday existed beyond business obligations." He paused, then added, "Now you have a tree and strangers coming to your private residence. Things change," Lysander said, the response inadequate even to his own ears. He couldn't explain to Marcus what he didn't fully understand himself, couldn't articulate why a 6-year-old's hug had created fault lines and foundations he'd thought were permanent. I'm allowed to decide I want a decorated tree. The defensive edge in his voice revealed more than the words themselves. You're allowed to do whatever you want, Marcus agreed, his tone suggesting this freedom was precisely what concerned him. I'm just noting that sudden changes in pattern often indicate something worth examining. He moved further into the room, instincts honed by decades of threat assessment, making him scrutinize the tree like it might contain surveillance equipment. Who are these people, really? Lysander considered how much to reveal, weighed the benefits of transparency against the vulnerability it required. I met the child on Christmas Eve, he finally said, offering truth carefully edited for palatability. She was looking at Christmas displays. We talked. She offered to help decorate if I needed it. He deliberately left out the Sterling Street building, the absent Santa Claus, the mother working night shifts. So you decided to hire her and her mother to come to your home, Marcus summarized, each word precisely weighted to highlight the absurdity without directly criticizing. Despite knowing nothing about them beyond a conversation outside a store, he crossed his arms, settling into the stance that meant this discussion wouldn't end until he was satisfied. That's not like you. Maybe it should be, Lysander replied, surprising himself with the admission. Maybe spending 15 years avoiding any interaction that might lead to actual connection wasn't the triumph of discipline I thought it was. The words emerged with heat he hadn't known he was carrying, frustration with a life that had become successfully empty. Marcus's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been understanding, though he masked it quickly behind professional neutrality. I'm not criticizing your choices, he said, tone gentling slightly. I'm trying to understand what's changed so I can adjust security protocols appropriately. He paused, then added more quietly, and maybe make sure you're not setting yourself up for the kind of hurt you've worked very hard to avoid. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy, because Marcus had been there for the aftermath of the loss that had reshaped Lysander's entire approach to human connection. He'd watched a grieving 20-year-old systematically dismantle every relationship that required emotional vulnerability, building walls that turned into a prison so gradually no one noticed until it was too late to escape. I'm not setting myself up for anything, Lysander said, the lie obvious to both of them. Then what are you doing? Marcus asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Because from where I'm standing, you're making yourself vulnerable to people you have no reason to trust, which is either growth or self-destruction, and I can't tell which. Lysander walked to the window overlooking the city, finding the neighborhood where Sterling Street sat among blocks of converted warehouses and struggling businesses. Maybe both, he admitted, the honesty feeling like removing armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it was removable. Maybe I'm tired of being safe and alone. Maybe meeting that child reminded me I used to want things besides control. Marcus joined him at the window, following his gaze toward the older district visible in the distance. The mother, he said, understanding clicking into place with the intuition that came from knowing Lysander too well. You're interested in the mother. It wasn't quite a question, more an observation waiting for confirmation or denial. I don't know what I am, Lysander replied, which was more honest than any specific claim would have been. I know that talking to them felt different than any interaction I've had in years. I know that the child hugged me, and something that had been frozen started thawing. He turned to face Marcus directly. I know that sounds pathetic. It sounds human, Marcus corrected, his usually stern features softening into something almost paternal, which is not something I've been able to say about you for a long time. He sighed, coming to some internal decision. I'll run background on them. Nothing invasive, just making sure they are who they appear to be. And I'll adjust tomorrow's security to give you privacy while maintaining protocols. Lysander nodded acceptance, knowing this was Marcus's way of showing care through professional competence. Thank you, he said, meaning it for more than just the security arrangements, for not trying to talk me out of this, even though part of him wished someone would provide a logical reason to cancel Monday's arrangement, to retreat back into the safety of isolation. I stopped trying to protect you from yourself years ago, Marcus replied with dry humor. Now I just try to minimize collateral damage when you finally decide to feel something. He headed toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope this works out however you're hoping it works out. You deserve to have something in your life besides obligation and control. Monday afternoon transformed Lysander's normally ordered routine into a state of barely controlled chaos that started when he changed clothes 3 times before settling on casual slacks and a sweater that projected approachable wealth rather than intimidating power. The penthouse staff had been given the day off, leaving him alone with a decorated but empty space that suddenly felt too large and too silent. He'd arranged delivery of decoration boxes from 5 different luxury retailers, curating options without actually choosing anything definitive because that was supposedly what he was hiring Everly and Bertie to help with. The boxes sat stacked in the living room like evidence of either excessive preparation or inability to make simple decisions, containing everything from traditional glass ornaments to modern geometric shapes in metals and acrylics. Lysander had spent an irrational amount of time Sunday evening researching Christmas decoration trends, reading articles about color theory and composition, like he was preparing for a business negotiation rather than a simple afternoon with a woman and her daughter. 1:30 arrived with the precision of appointments that mattered, and building security called to announce his guests had been cleared through the lobby. Lysander's heart rate increased in a way it hadn't